The sun had baked Dry Willow Junction into a hard, cracked shell of a town, a place where the wind carried more dust than mercy, and the people carried more fear than kindness. It sat hunched in a patch of brittle earth, hemmed in by sun-bleached canyons that glowed red in the dying light, as if the land itself bled from 1,000 old wounds. Water was scarce, and decency scarcer. The folks who stayed behind did so because they had nowhere else to go, or no longer remembered what it felt like to be free. A man like Vernon Cray thrived in a place like that. Cray owned more than land. He owned the very breath of Dry Willow. His cattle roamed farther than most men dared ride. His fences marked the horizon, and his word carried weight heavier than a judge's gavel. He wasn't a lawman, though he claimed to enforce the law. Wasn't a preacher, though folks mumbled his name like a curse come Sunday. There were whispers that Cray had hanged his own brother for rustling a cow, and not a soul had ever found the nerve to speak of it in daylight. People said the land turned men cruel out here. I reckon sometimes the land just gives men like Vernon Cray room to stretch. That summer, the drought came mean. Chickens dropped dead in their nests, their feathers dulled and brittle. Cattle ribs showed sharp through their hides, and old women learned to make soup from bones gone hollow. It was in such a season that a slip of a girl named Mara Bell came to Dry Willow Junction. Nobody rightly knew who she belonged to. Some said she was a trapper's child, orphaned after a fever swept through the mountains. Others claimed she'd been born to a saloon girl who vanished when the river flooded 5 years back. Whoever she was, Mara had become the town's ghost, flitting from shadow to shadow, barefoot and bone-thin, her face streaked with dust and desperation. Her hair hung in clumps, dark and tangled, her eyes wide as wagon wheels, too old for a child and too young for what she'd seen. That evening, when the sky was turning the color of a fresh bruise, Mara's hunger gnawed louder than her sense. She crept along the dry creek bed toward Vernon Cray's spread, where the last few chickens clucked in misery behind a leaning fence. She knew better. Every child in Dry Willow did, but empty bellies spoke louder than old warnings, and a handful of cracked corn was worth risking the devil's hand. Mara slipped through a gap in the fence, careful not to stir the dust. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, snatching at the scattered feed, like a starved animal, stuffing it into her mouth before the pain in her stomach could remind her of its limits. The kernels were hard, bitter, but it didn't matter. She ate them like they were pearls. Then a voice split the dusk. Well, well, look what the coyotes dragged in. Cray's foreman, a squat, red-faced man named Duggan, loomed above her, a rusted lantern in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. Behind him came two of Cray's hired hands, young men with the kind of eyes that learned to stop looking a long time ago. Mara scrambled to her feet, the feed spilling from her hands, but Duggan caught her by the arm, his grip like iron. The girl didn't scream. She'd learned years ago it never did any good. What's this now? Duggan grinned, showing yellow teeth. Stealin' from Mr. Cray, are ya? She tried to twist free, but one of the others grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. Please, Mara whispered, though she knew it was wasted breath. Vernon Cray himself appeared then, striding out from the house, like a wolf come to sniff a rabbit. His face was lean, weathered, and sharp as the edge of a rusted blade. He didn't ask what happened. Didn't need to. What's the penalty for a thief in Dry Willow, boys? Cray asked, his voice calm, like a man asking the time of day. Duggan chuckled. A lesson she won't forget. Cray's eyes, cold and colorless as winter ice, settled on Mara. Lock her in the henhouse. One of the hired hands hesitated. Sir, them birds, some died in there this morning. Cray shrugged. Let her keep him company. Ain't no place better for a thief than with the dead. They dragged her across the yard while the last light bled out of the sky. The henhouse was a sagging, rancid thing, its wood black with rot, the air thick with the stink of feathers, old blood, and death. A few dead hens lay in the corners, flies buzzing around their stiffened wings. The door slammed shut behind her. She didn't cry. There wasn't a tear left in her to shed. In Dry Willow Junction, folks saw what happened. The blacksmith's wife peered through a curtain. The preacher turned his face toward his empty supper plate. The saloon's piano kept on playing. No one spoke a word. See, in places like that, Cruelty was just part of the weather. Folks could turn their heads from a child suffering if it meant peace, with a man like Cray. The world was full of men who'd rather let the innocent rot in a henhouse than risk the noose or a bullet. I remember it. Remember how the dust tasted in the air that night, and how the moon looked like a skull hung over the canyons. That's the kind of thing a man don't forget. And in that darkness, with dead hens for company, and a belly full of gravel and fear, little Maribel waited for death, or something worse. The heat hung over Dry Willow Junction like a suffocating veil, thick and heavy, pressing down on every man, woman, and creature unlucky enough to breathe beneath it. Dust devils danced along the rutted main street, and the sun's glare bounced off rusted tin roofs, scalding the skin and boiling the patience out of men. It was a place forgotten by God and claimed by men like Vernon Cray, where the only law was the kind that came at the end of a barrel. Just past noon, when the heat shimmered like a ghost over the horizon, a lone rider appeared on the southern trail. His horse, a broad-shouldered, mud-brown gelding, moved with the weary patience of an animal that had carried its rider a long, hard way. The man in the saddle was older than most could guess, gray-bearded, sun-darkened, and broad across the shoulders, with a lean, wiry frame built for survival, not show. His clothes were the color of earth and ash, so battered by dust and weather that no one could have said what shade they'd once been. His name, if anyone cared enough to ask, was Jonas. But in Dry Willow, folks didn't ask questions of strangers, not unless they had a death wish. Jonas's hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, though the sharp glint of his eyes cut through the brim's darkness like twin shards of flint. Those eyes swept the town in a slow, measured pass, over the crack-clabbered buildings, the sagging rail fences, the weather-beaten faces watching from shaded porches and behind grimy windows. Nobody greeted him. Nobody waved. A man passing through this kind of place kept his head down, tipped his hat, and moved on. But Jonas didn't. His horse clopped steadily down the main street, past the livery, the smithy, and the leaning church with its half-missing steeple. A pair of scrawny dogs slunk out of his path, tails tucked. Women moved away from windows. Even the wind seemed to falter. At the heart of town stood the saloon, a warped, two-story structure of sun-bleached wood and dust-caked windows. Inside, the stink of sweat, spilled whiskey, and hopelessness hung thick in the air. Men clustered around battered tables, most of them wearing Cray's brand either on their clothing or their souls. Vernon Cray himself sat near the back, surrounded by his usual pack of jackals, his boots up on a table, laughing loud at some crude joke. Jonas stepped through the swinging doors and let the room settle. A few heads turned. Conversations stuttered to a halt. The clink of glass against wood was the only sound. He crossed the room without a word, his spurs barely whispering against the floorboards. The bartender, a stoop-shouldered man with a dringer's face, gave him a wary glance. "Whiskey," Jonas said, his voice rough as gravel. The glass arrived quickly, and Jonas took it without ceremony, leaning against the bar as though he meant to stay a while. He didn't look at Cray, but he felt the man's gaze settle on him like a heatless brand. The talk started up again, cautious, threadbare. In its wake came the whispers, low voices passing words like smuggled contraband. "Girl still in that hen house. 3 days, they say. Ain't right even for Cray." Jonas's ears picked up every word, though no one spoke her name. Not out loud. Not in Dry Willow. At the far end of the bar, an old-timer with a beard like Spanish moss and a face seamed with sun and sorrow raised his cup and muttered to no one in particular, "Some devils ain't from hell. They're from Dry Willow." Jonas drained his glass and set it down with a decisive click. He left the saloon the same way he'd come, quiet and steady, his shadow long and crooked in the late afternoon light. Out by the stables, a boy no older than 14 swept at the dirt floor with a twig broom, his eyes down, his shoulders hunched. Jonas approached. "Hen house," he said. The boy's hands tightened on the broom. He didn't look up. Jonas waited. At last, the boy jerked his head toward the far end of the yard where a squat, half-collapsed structure sagged against a dry well. Jonas nodded once and walked away. By sundown, the light had turned a deep, bloody orange. The canyons caught the glow, and the world looked like it was ablaze. Two of Cray's men stood by the henhouse, leaning on the fence, a bottle passing between them. Their laughter was thick and mean, born of drink and cowardice. Jonas came up the trail without making a sound. "Hey, old-timer," one of them called, his grin lopsided. "This here's private land." Jonas kept walking. "Deaf, are ya?" The first man took a step forward, reaching for his pistol, but Jonas moved like a rattler striking. A swift, brutal punch to the throat dropped him to the dirt, wheezing like a kick dog. The second man barely had time to shout before Jonas clubbed him with the butt of his revolver, sending him crumpling against the fence. Neither would be standing again soon. Jonas pushed open the henhouse door. The stench hit him first, sour death, stale feathers, filth, and despair. In the murky gloom, he saw her. A small, filthy figure huddled in the far corner, her hair matted, skin raw with scratches and filth. Her eyes, huge and hollow, locked onto his, and for a moment there was nothing in that room but the sound of dust shifting. He crossed to her and knelt. "Can you stand?" he asked, though he knew the answer before she shook her head. He gathered her up, cradling her light, broken frame against his chest. She weighed little more than a bundle of rags. Outside, the yard had gone quiet. Cray's men, hearing the commotion, spilled out of the house, guns half drawn, their faces split between fear and fury. Jonas stepped into the open, the girl in his arms, the setting sun at his back. His revolver hung loose at his side. Duggan, Cray's foreman, spat. "Put her down, old man." A dozen barrels pointed his way. Jonas didn't flinch. "She's mine," he said. And in that instant, something shifted in the air, the kind of moment folks remember long after their bones have turned to dust. Vernon Cray didn't take insults kindly. By nightfall, word had spread from the saloon to the livery to the church steps about what had happened at his ranch, about the stranger, about the girl, about how one old man had walked onto Cray's land, knocked his men into the dirt, and taken what he pleased. By moonrise, Cray had nailed a scrap of paper to the saloon's door. Wanted Jonas, dead or alive, /$500 gold. In Dry Willow Junction, $500 was enough to make even a man's brother look at him crosswise. Cray's bounty wasn't about the money, though. It was about pride, about fear. The kind of fear that gnaws at a man's bones when he realizes for the first time that maybe, just maybe, he ain't the biggest devil in town. Outside the town's reach, where a line of dead cottonwoods slumped against a dried creek, Jonas had made a rough camp. No fire, just the smell of dirt, leather, and dust settling in the cooling air. Mara lay on a bed of saddle blankets, a ragged wool coat pulled over her to keep the chill at bay. She looked small under it, a slip of a girl with hollowed cheeks and the kind of eyes no child ought to have. Jonas cleaned the cuts on her arms with water from his canteen, working with the care of a man who'd done this before for other broken souls. He spoke little, didn't ask her name, didn't ask her story. The only sounds were the rasp of cloth against skin, the distant howl of a coyote, and the steady breath of a horse somewhere nearby. After a long while, Mara's voice came out of the dark, thin as paper. "My ma's been gone since I was little," she whispered. "Never knew my pa. Folks said he was a drifter, mean one. Some nights he'd come through town. Folks would lock up tight when they saw him." Jonas didn't reply. She shifted beneath the coat. "Old lady took me in for a while. Made me work the coops. Beat me when the eggs went missing, even when it weren't me. When she died, Cray said I owed him for her debts. Been running since." She spoke like she was reciting a list of chores. Not bitter, not afraid, just facts. Jonas poured a little more water onto a cloth, wrung it out, and dabbed at a split lip. He could feel how thin her face had become, skin stretched over sharp bones. He'd seen it before. Town after town, girl after girl. Places where men like Cray grew fat on the bones of the desperate. He thought of another girl then. Yellow hair, soft laugh. His daughter. The memory was so old it felt like a scar that ached before a storm. And the night she and her mother were taken from him. A blood trail through the sagebrush, faces leering from behind kerchiefs, a fire burning too fast and too bright. He chased those men down one by one. It had taken him 5 years to find the last one. A hand drifting to his pistol's grip brought back the feel of that old rage. It wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, heavy, like something he carried in his gut, weighty as a chain. In town, the fear was beginning to grow. The town marshal, Jed Monroe, a thick-bellied man who spent more time in the saloon than his office, was summoned to Cray's house just after midnight. Cray, red-faced and pacing like a bull about to gore, laid down the bounty in no uncertain terms. Jed, slick with sweat, wiped his brow with a handkerchief and shook his head. "Vernon, you know I can't be getting mixed up in this. That old man's not my problem. You're paid to keep order." Cray growled. "I keep it for the town, not your petty grudges. Besides," Jed's voice faltered, "ain't no law against an old man talking and a half-dead girl." Cray slammed a bottle against the wall. "There is now." Jed left the house with shaking hands and went straight to the saloon. It was there, with a bottle in hand and his nerve shot, that the old-timer at the bar spoke up again. "You know what that mark is on his eye?" The man rasped, teeth stained with tobacco. "What mark?" Jed muttered. "On the grip. Snake twined round a busted badge." Jed went still. "I seen it before," the old man went on. "Back when I rode south near the border. They called him Snakebite Jonas. Said he was a lawman once. A U.S. deputy marshal. He hunted men, bad men. Ones other marshals were too scared to touch. They say he put down a whole gang of Comancheros by his lonesome. Took a bullet through the lung and kept coming to." The old man sipped his drink. "Then he just disappeared." "Nonsense," one of Cray's men snorted. "Old wives' tales." But the words had taken hold. In a town like Dry Willow, stories mattered. Names mattered. And Snakebite Jonas was one of those names men whispered over campfires and spoke of like a bad dream. By the time dawn's first light broke over the canyons, Cray's hired guns had gathered on the main street, rifles loaded, eyes darting to every shadow. None of them spoke of legends. Not openly. But each man wondered if the dust they saw blowing across the trail might carry death on its back. Cray paced the porch of his house, spitting curses. He'd hunted men before, but this one gnawed at him. Like a bad tooth, he couldn't leave alone. He dismissed the old stories with a snarl, but even he felt a cold knot deep in his belly. Because the thing about old tales is, some of them are true. The dawn came thick and gray, a low haze hanging over Dry Willow Junction like a heavy cloth. The sun barely cut through, a pale disk over the ridges, and the dust lay still, waiting for someone to stir it. The streets were too quiet for a town that size. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn. No livestock bleated, no wagons rolled. Only the sound of leather creaking and boots shifting in place broke the hush, where a dozen armed men stood gathered outside the saloon. Vernon Cray paced among them like a wolf among dogs. His face was drawn tight, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, the edges of his fury raw and fraying. His rifle hung from his shoulder, a revolver on his hip. The men around him grinned and spat, boasting loud and empty words, though every one of them felt the tight pull of dread curling in their gut. A low shape appeared at the far end of the street, a rider moving slow and steady, his silhouette a smear of shadow against the pale sky. The gelding trotted forward with the heavy patience of a beast that had seen too much and cared too little. Jonas came like a storm about to break. His hat was pulled low, the long gray fringe of his beard moving in the thin breeze. The mark on his pistol grip caught the faint light, the rattlesnake coiled around the broken badge. Some men saw it and felt their mouths go dry. He stopped halfway down the street, dismounted without a word, and let the dust settle around his boots. The only sound was the faint clink of spurs, and the town holding its breath. Cray stepped forward. "You got stones, old man. I'll give you that. Thought you'd run off like every other coward who's crossed me." Jonas said nothing, his gaze steady beneath the brim. "You ain't leaving here alive, boy," Cray went on, voice rising as though loudness alone might chase the death he felt creeping closer. "You don't get to crawl out of nowhere and take what's mine. Not in my town." Jonas's voice, when it came, was a low rasp, thick as gravel. "Ain't your town. Never was. Just a pile of dust you poisoned long enough folks forgot what right looks like. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Cray's face, but he buried it in a sneer. You're a dead man, Jonas. Been dead a long while, Jonas muttered. Cray drew in a breath and spat. Kill him. The world moved like it cracked in half. Jonas's hand blurred toward his Colt before half the man could think to pull iron. The gun roared, a hard, brutal sound that echoed against the buildings. A man to Cray's right dropped, a bullet through his throat. Another staggered back, clutching a gut wound. The rest scrambled to draw, but Jonas was already moving, stepping aside, the dust rising in curls around his boots. A second shot shattered a rifle from a man's hands. A third found a chest, sending its owner sprawling onto the dirt. Gunfire burst in sharp, panicked volleys. Bullets chewed the saloon's walls, splintering wood and shattering windows. Shouts rose, frantic curses, the reek of black powder thick in the air. Jonas rolled behind a trough, returning fire with cold, surgical precision. Each shot landed. A kneecap shattered. A shoulder spun backward. Another man's pistol clattered to the ground as he screamed. The street churned with smoke and dirt. Horses reared in the livery, and townsfolk peeked through cracks in their doors, watching death walk their streets. From the edge of the square, a small figure appeared, Mara, pale and thin, a bandage on her lip, her eyes locked on the chaos before her. She stood still, as though the wind alone kept her upright. Cray ducked behind a post, face gleaming with sweat. Only 4 of his men remained standing. The others lay scattered in the dust like discarded tools. Jonas stepped into the open, his hat shadowing his face, his Colt leveled straight at Cray's heart. You're finished, Vernon. Cray barked a harsh laugh, though it cracked halfway. This town's mine. Always was, always will be. You can kill me, but there'll be another, and another after that. Jonas didn't lower his gun. From his pocket, he pulled something, a badge, old and weathered, the metal dulled, but the words still clear beneath grime and years. U.S., Deputy Marshal. For a moment, even the wind stopped. That name mean anything to you? Jonas asked. A flicker of disbelief crossed Cray's face. That's a dead man's badge. Been a lot of dead men, Jonas said. A shot rang out. Jonas's bullet took the pistol clean out of Cray's hand, sending it clattering to the dust. Cray dropped to his knees, clutching his hand, blood seeping between his fingers. The townsfolk gathered in the distance now, moving in ones and twos, drawn by the sound of a man's power breaking. Get up, Jonas ordered, his voice like stone breaking under pressure. Cray stumbled to his feet, swaying. Say it, Jonas growled. Cray hesitated. Then, with a pistol barrel staring down at him, his voice cracked. I hanged 3 men for land that wasn't mine. Starved kids for debts. Took what I pleased because no one stopped me. The town doctor stepped out from the crowd. The blacksmith followed, his hammer slung over one shoulder. The preacher appeared, face pale. Jonas turned his gaze to them. Yours now. He keeps breathing. It's 'cause you let him. The men exchanged glances. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The kind of moment that towns are built or broken on. The blacksmith stepped forward. He ain't breathing come sundown. Cray's last loyal man, a lanky youth with trembling hands, made a move toward a hidden derringer in his boot. Before anyone else could react, a sharp report cut the air. The boy staggered, a bullet hole in his chest. Mara stood at the edge of the street, a rifle in her small hands, the barrel still smoking. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the doctor nodded. Haven't seen justice in these parts in years. By sundown, Cray swung from the big sycamore on the edge of town. The townsfolk gathered, not out of bloodlust but necessity. A cleansing, a reckoning. Jonas didn't stay to watch. He saddled his gelding, tipped his hat to Mara, and rode toward the horizon without a word. The dust swallowed him whole, leaving only his legend behind. The sun was low in the sky now, slipping toward the canyons, where the land folded into itself, and the shadows stretched long and thin. Dry Willow Junction, for the first time in memory, sat quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air feels scrubbed clean, and people step out of their homes blinking into the light, unsure whether to mourn or be grateful. The dust still clung to the streets, and the bullet scars in the saloon's walls hadn't gone anywhere, but something in the air had shifted. The weight was gone. Mara stood near the doctor's house, her face still pale but cleaner now. The ragged dress traded for a threadbare calico one that hung a little loose on her thin frame. The doctor's wife, a kind woman with sad eyes, had brushed the knots from her hair and tied it back with a ribbon faded from too many summers. She'd eaten her first real meal in days, and though the ache in her belly hadn't fully left, something else had taken its place, something harder, steadier. She watched as Jonas saddled his horse at the edge of town. The old gelding shifted under the weight, and Jonas cinched the strap tight, his movements slow and practiced. The townsfolk offered nods and murmured thanks as they passed, but none dared ask him to stay. Men like Jonas didn't belong in places where peace had to be rebuilt. They came like storms and left the same way. Mara didn't think about what she was doing, only that she couldn't let him leave without an answer. She crossed the street, boots scuffing the dust, the copper evening light glinting off the silver star still pinned to his chest. She stopped a few steps away. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, voice steady despite the quiver in her gut. "Why me?" Jonas looked down at her. His face was a map of old scars and years spent under cruel skies, but there was something in his eyes that softened then. Not pity, not sorrow, but recognition. "Because no one else would," he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small, worn coin. It caught the light, a flash of silver dulled by age. Carved into one side was the same rattlesnake coiled around a broken badge, the same emblem that marked his pistol. He placed it in her hand, his fingers closing hers gently around it. "You keep this," Jonas told her. "A reminder. Don't let men like Cray tell you what you're worth. Not ever again." She stared down at the coin. It felt heavier than it looked, cool against her palm. When she looked up, Jonas was already mounting his horse. The town doctor appeared on the porch, his wife beside him, a hand resting on Mara's shoulder. The blacksmith nodded from his doorway. Folks who hadn't spoken to one another in years exchanged cautious glances. They would rebuild, one hard day at a time. Jonas tipped his hat to them all, a small gesture that somehow felt like a passing of weight. And then, without fanfare, he turned his horse toward the open desert. The gelding moved into a steady, unhurried trot, carrying him toward the horizon where the land shimmered in the dying light. The dust kicked up behind him, and the wind rose like a hush settling over the town. Some folks say he died out there in those badlands, that the heat and the years finally claimed him. Others swear they saw him again, in other towns where evil took root and good men did nothing. They tell stories about a ghost lawman, one who rode where justice refused to go, who carried a snake on his pistol grip and a badge so old the words were worn smooth. I don't know what's true, but I'll tell you this. When a place forgets what right looks like, when men like Vernon Cray bleed a town dry and folks grow too scared to fight, there's always a rider in the distance. And though his face might change, and the years might wear him down, the fire in him don't die easy. Some call him Snakebite Jonas. Some call him Death in the Dust. Doesn't much matter. The name ain't what makes the legend. It's the man who refuses to let the cruel ones decide who gets to stand and who gets to kneel. That day, as the sun slid behind the canyons and night began to fold over Dry Willow, Mara stood alone at the edge of the street, watching the last of the dust from his horse's hooves settle. She opened her palm and looked down at the coin. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dusk, the coiled snake catching what little light was left. And though her hands were small and thin, and her bones still ached from too many empty days, something hard as steel flickered behind her eyes. She gripped the coin tight. The desert swallowed the rider, but the legend, it rode on,